Hello, everybody. For those who don't know, my name is Edmund Berger. I'm a writer and independent researcher living in Kentucky, in the United States. You might know me from any of my blogs like Deterritorial Investigations Unit or DI Subunit 22, maybe Synthetic Zero, and maybe more recently Vast Abrupt. The paper that I am presenting here is called Waveforms, and this is a kind of shortened alter version of the one that will be coming out in print. Now, the printed version is an exercise in excess, probably a bit too much in retrospect, and trying to condense it down into something manageable with this was also quite a task. So I have lots of pages to go through and a limited amount of time, so I'm just going to jump right in and move pretty quickly. So hope you all enjoy it. The development of productive forces proceeds in neither a straight linear fashion, nor are they subjected to absolute flux, where the interplay of random events, human ingenuity, government assistance, or irresponsibility call the shots. There can be no doubt that both of these appear as correct depending on the vantage point that one takes. A certain analytic frame produces exponentiating sequences as increasing lock-in and seemingly drag the economy to a singularity point, while others foreground the essential nature of human action or inaction, understood in this flattened way as something always so messy and caught up in the slipstream of events beyond itself. Some approaches emphasize the self-organizing power of the marketplace. Others counter this with the vital necessity of a governmental, institutional baseline for these processes to exist in the first place. Standing apart from various piecemeal theories and capable of slipping through the nets they cast are cycle or wave theories of development. In a footnote to the 30th chapter of the third volume of Marx's Capital, Engels observed that the roughly 10-year industrial cycle was being superseded by something much grander. A wider, deeper cycle. He initially mistook this as the 10-year cycle being elongated. Is it possible, he asks, that we are now in the preparatory stage of a new world crash of unparalleled vehemence? The footnote closes on an even more ominous note, with a passing reflection not only on the germ of a far more powerful future crisis being carried on these winds of change, but on the groundwork being laid for the ultimate industrial general war. We would be hard-pressed not to see in Engels' words a foreshadow of the catastrophic upheavals of the first half of the 20th century, a volley of revolutions and counter-revolutions, the widening gyre of economic crises, and the spread of the war machine across the many surfaces of the globe. Crisis, for Marx, not only results from the tensions and contradictions internal to the pathway of development, it also plays a role in ensuring and empowering it. The momentary breakdown of the process would have prepared, within capitalist limits, a subsequent expansion of production. And indeed, in the aftermath of the great crises and conflicts of the early to mid-20th century, there was remarkable historical global growth, an incredible leap forward in the standard of living, technological development, governmental relations, etc., etc. But it would only be a momentary, not eternal golden age. We find ourselves, a decade out from the crisis that brought with it a destabilizing effect worldwide, facing the rising floodwaters of reaction, of an ambiguous economic situation, of the colonization of any sort of free time, of widening precarity, all occurring paradoxically in a time with the means to alleviate these issues and many others can be apparently glimpsed. We find ourselves at a point in a great techno-political wave, a temporal cresting point where possibilities dance between the possible and foreclosure of these very possibilities. It was the Soviet economist by the name of Nikolai Kondratiev who brought into relief a clear picture of how these techno-political waves operate. Rummaging through dense reams of statistical data on commodity prices, interest rate movement, wage fluctuations, trade volumes, heavy industrial output, and other aggregates, he found that there appeared to be multiple waves, roughly 40 to 70 years in duration, based on alternating periods of prosperity and growth, followed by stagnation and slowdown. Even within these alternations, however, internal cycles, or intermediate cycles of growth and decline could be found. And here's a quote from Kondratiev. The long waves really belong to the same complex dynamic process in which the intermediate cycles of the capitalistic economy, with their principal phases of upswing and depression, run their course. These intermediary cycles, however, secure a certain stamp from the very existence of the long waves. Our investigation demonstrates that during the rising of the long waves, years of prosperity are more numerous, whereas years of depression predominate during the downswing. Kondratiev argued that innovation played a fundamental role, though he did not necessarily view it as the primary causal factor in driving the rise, peak, and fall of the wave. Such a perspective was picked up and emphasized later by the economist Joseph Schumpeter, even though for this economist it was the turbulence of investment behavior that served as the motive force for the half-century plus cycling. To fully appreciate the nature of the Kondratiev wave, however, the role played by innovation must be foregrounded. We find such a perspective in the writings of Carlotta Perez, who crosses the wave with Giovanni Dossi's concept of the technological paradigm. Like the similar notion of the scientific paradigm, the technological paradigm is composed of a technical matrix that is bundled together with practices, forms of organization, regulation understood in both the most specific and in the broadest sense, and developmental logic specific to it. The technological paradigm has a direction, a technological trajectory, or an idea of progress that dictates the manner in which the problem-solving processes are executed. Running Kondratiev and Dossi together, Perez is able to find the general architecture of the waveform, which composes itself as a kind of progressive rhythm. Perez identifies two primary movements that compose the majority of the wave's duration: the installation phase, which composes roughly the first half of the wave, and the deployment period, the latter half. The installation phase and the deployment period are in turn separated by a turning point, which is typified by an economic crisis and its subsequent resolution. Nested within these two phases, additional elements are to be found. The installation period begins, in fact, during the downswing of the deployment phase of the preceding wave. As the deployment period begins to slow down, investment in capital begins to flow outwards towards a cluster of accumulating innovations. With the realization of elite technology, a big bang occurs. The installation period sweeps up into a wild eruption as capital abandons the old systems and objects and floods this new dynamic possibility space. The eruption soon becomes a frenzy. A veritable euphoria moves across the business world as many booms and busts oscillate. Wealth expands and investment opportunities multiply. Underneath it all, a great bubble builds, but with all bubbles, a burst will sooner or later occur. The business euphoria has become detached entirely from the conditions of the real economy, which exists out of joint from the true potentials and institutional demands of the new paradigm. Yet the crisis that explodes from the bursting of the bubble is not solely destructive. It liquidates capital that has been poorly invested and forces the movement towards productive ends, while also highlighting the various institutional contradictions taking place not only across private and public sectors, but in civil society as well, that have been neglected in the buildup. Resolution of the crisis is not only dependent upon the reconstruction of capital flows and investment patterns, but on the institutional recomposition that will span not only multiple organizations, but class composition, governmental regulation and structure, as well as all sorts of formal and informal practices, norms, protocols, unique to the demands of the paradigm in question. If successfully carried out, the institutional recomposition or adaptation heralds the coming of the deployment period, as the rebound from the crisis sets into the synergetic moment, typified by stable growth, increased employment, and an overall vibrancy in the economy, the dawning of an all-too-temporary golden age. And after synergy, maturity, reach when the innovative possibilities of the whole system begins to wane and the corresponding markets come to saturate themselves. The accelerating returns and prosperity of the synergetic phase begins to slow and decline. The deployment period as a whole moves out of its golden age into a period of stagnation, and the process begins to begin again and again. 5 such waves can be identified as having occurred since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. These are 5 grand movements that compose the inner rhythm of modernity itself, catalyzing and destabilizing, constituting again. First, the Industrial Revolution, itself kicking off in the 1770s and ending in the 1820s, with a turning point in the crisis of the mid-1790s. Then a successor wave, organized around steam power, which began in the 1820s. It experienced a crisis starting in 1848 and wound down in the mid-1870s, but then came the K-wave based on electrification, which picked up in the 1870s and persisted until 1920. There was a long and turbulent crisis in the 1890s, a period identified by certain Marxists affiliated with the French syndicalists as a period of capitalist decadence, or in other words, a phase of capitalism that was subjected to entropic decay. The next K-wave, the wave based on Fordist mass production, kicked off around 1910. I've already mentioned the extreme nature of the crisis, as well as the unbounded growth of the Golden Age. Finally, we arrive at the current wave, put into motion by information communication technologies, which can be equated as a post-Fordist epoch. Based on cybernetic technologies that began to accumulate during the Second World War, it is best understood as having only begun after the stagnation of the 1970s, in the midst of the Reaganite and Thatcherite 1980s. Here we find not only one, but two crises that have destabilized this wave. The first of these was the bursting of the dot-com bubble, which lasted between March of 2000 and October of 2002, after having escalated for some 5 years of euphoric growth. The second was the Great Recession, which erupted in 2007 and formally ended in 2009. Through long-range stagnation and general instability, seemed to have been the result of what may have been a failure to undergo institutional recomposition. But more on that in just a moment. After this long, rambling, and all too compressed summary of the basic elements of Perez's long wave, I'm going to shift gears and talk about the real topic that we're interested in here tonight: blockchain technology. The big question, from the point of view of these sorts of theories, is how to approach the introduction of blockchain. For its proponents, this tech holds the promise of an entirely new wave. For others, it is just another technological element in a vast constellation of tools and techniques that characterize the current stage of development. And for its detractors, it is much ado about nothing. Ultimately, it's impossible to determine in advance how this will shape out. The history of innovation, after all, is frequently characterized by the failure of the expected, the success of the unexpected, and likewise, in the cases of cycle or wave phenomena, it is always in hindsight that we can piece together these systems. With time variables in terms of duration and shifting points, we can never pinpoint for certain where exactly we are, except maybe in the throes of an economic crisis or in the subsequent phase of robust growth that tends to follow these crises. And there's no guarantee that just because the architecture of the K-wave can be glimpsed in the past, that it will continue into the future. That said, I'd like to offer a few comments, hypothetical speculations really, on how I think this architecture connects to this meta-systemic process going forward. And to begin with, I'd like to take perhaps the less exciting position that blockchain does not constitute a technology that will actualize a new wave. Instead, I think that we should contextualize blockchain as a technology or a forerunner to a technology to come that will open up the possibilities for an adequate institutional recomposition for the current information communication technology-oriented new wave. The implication is, of course, that we've yet to see a real institutional recomposition following the last crisis. We may be a decade out from it, but not only do its effects still linger, uneven and combined as they are across the vast developmental terrain, but no golden age of growth appears to have taken root. If anything, many of the leading countries, namely the US, but also many in Western Europe, are limping along, barely skirting the return of crisis conditions and deferring the bubbling tensions with a fairly incoherent ad hoc fix-it measures that are all too typical of the so-called neoliberal regime. Against this picture, innovation has not slowed down, and in many quarters it has picked up speed. The narrative chaos surrounding the new social media ecologies, the way that they interface with traditional forms of life and media, is just one indication of how there is a clash between yesteryear's modes of regulation and the current emergent systems. We can also see that from the point of view of these traditional structures, there seems to be no means of attaining a rational control over emergent technological systems. Similarly, we may look to the consistent failure to resolve the escalation of automation and production with regard to the conditions of labor that are necessary to uphold the bourgeois mode of distribution. In the long run, it's probably untenable to think that there are eternal solutions to any of these problems. As somebody committed to Marxist critique, I believe that they carry with them the seeds of capitalism's ultimate demise. But in the short term, we can see how the task of navigating these problems, finding solutions to them, serve as the processes through which we advance to the higher stages of development. There appears to have been a direct relationship between the 2008 crisis and the introduction of this innovative complex. Satoshi's initial blockchain white paper, for example, made its debut the month after the financial giant Lehman Brothers went bottom up. As one professor from the Kellogg School of Management's pointed out, the quest to be decentralized can be tied to a financial crisis. But if we didn't have Bitcoin, it's likely that something else would have it's likely that something else to challenge centralized payment systems would have emerged. The reason for this is that the root of the concept runs deep, stretching back to the anarchic world of the cypherpunks in the early 1990s. For these people, the major transformation of information communication technology was engendering what we will call disintermediation, which is to say, centralized nodes can be routed around. Gatekeeper functions collapse, regulations are circumvented, tools and techniques can no longer be monopolized by an elite few. For the cypherpunks, privacy became the end-all be-all, the mechanism necessary to realize this disintermediation. Privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. It's the opening line of the Cypherpunk Manifesto, written by Eric Hughes in 1993. He then goes on to argue that privacy is the power to selectively reveal oneself to the world. He continues by suggesting that because the mechanisms governing transactions automatically reveal one to the world, or at least to those who might be interested in your monetary flows moving across the economy, there must be some means to occulting these same transactions. He continues. Here's a longer quote from the manifesto. Privacy in an open society also requires cryptography. If I say something, I only want it to be heard by those for whom I intend it. If the content of my speech is available to the world, I have no privacy. To encrypt is to indicate the desire for privacy, and to encrypt with weak cryptography is to indicate not too much a desire for privacy. Furthermore, to reveal one's identity with assurance when the default is anonymity, that requires the cryptographic signature. Thus here we have the genesis of what would become the blockchain. Its relevance, from the point of view of the Great Recession, is the contention, which is almost universally libertarian in nature, that the disastrous events were the work of a too big government, armed with regulatory bodies and centralized banking, who progressively cartelized the global economic system into its too big to fail situation. This is correct in a certain surface sense of the matter, but it misses the more dynamic picture of long-term developmental processes and insurmountable contradictions that drive these very processes forward, all of it coming to bear again and again their full weight on society in the form of cataclysmic crises that in fact propel this entire contradiction-wrought structure further into the future. But this picture is one that absolutely levels the individual human agent. With their narrow focus on the issue of privacy, the libertarian cypherpunk, by contrast, elevates this very agent. There's an analytic loggerhead that separates the two, and clearly the cypherpunk, like their closely related Austrian kin, is snared in the trap of ideological mystification. That said, the trend that lurks behind this liberal account of atomization deserves consideration. One does not need to retreat to the idea of Homo economicus to observe how disintermediation is a real phenomenon, and one that is seemingly intrinsic to the contemporary K-wave. This isn't to say that disintermediation, or more properly, progressive decentralization, didn't occur in earlier phases. In some sense, these are macro-scale trends that are swinging towards decentralized, distributed forms of social organization. It achieves a higher degree of organizational logic in the current time. We can think of the Rand Corporation theorists writing at precisely the same time as the cypherpunks of emergent network-centric warfare, which is characterized by fluidity, the ability for rapid transformations, the formations of strange hybrids capable of coming together and breaking apart as they see fit. Seen from this point of view, the arc of modernity bends towards not only to the proliferation of vital nodes, but the ability of these nodes to realize themselves autonomous from their previously maintained fixity. Clearly, one can see the connection between cryptographic technologies and invisible transaction mechanisms like blockchain and Bitcoin with this evolution. This sets the stage for consideration of two possible paths for how these technologies might interface with a potential institutional recomposition. Nick Land's intervention into this debate constitutes something of a high point in that he advances Mencius Moldbug's neo-cameralist patchwork into this materialist evolution. From this ground, Bitcoin and blockchain are the initial shock of a truly multipolar globe where the world system is tossed into a continual flux through the unending proliferation of trustless peer-to-peer networks, decentralized autonomous organizations or DAOs, and self-sufficient, independent corporate city-states. Just as blockchain had its roots in the libertarian cypherpunk movement, these ideas ultimately derived from the closely connected realm of anarcho-capitalist theorizing about the possibility of for-profit charter cities and startup zones. Both Moldbug and Land contextualized the coming change as the creation of a global patchwork of competitive sovereign units organized around neo-camerist lines, that is, a sort of mercantile joint stock corporate structure that collapses together the economic and the political. To quote Moldbug by way of Land, let's start with my ideal world, the world of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of neo-cameralist city-states and mini-states, or neo-states. The organizations which own and operate these neo-states are for-profit sovereign corporations, or sovcors. For the moment, let's assume a one-to-one mapping between a sovcor and neo-state. Let's pin down the neo-cameralist or modus personae by identifying the people who work for the sovcor as its agents, the people or organizations which collectively own it as its subscribers, and the people who live in its neo-state as its residents. Every patch of land on the planet has a primary owner, which is its sovcor. Typically, these owners will be large impersonal corporations. We call them sovcors because they're sovereign. You're a sovereign if you have the power to render any plausible attack on your primary property by any other sovereign power unprofitable. In other words, you maintain a general deterrence. Sovereignty, this is definition, is a flat peer-to-peer relationship by definition. The concept of hierarchical sovereignty is a contradiction in terms. Now, Land argues that we can glimpse an emergent tendency pointing towards the state of affairs through what he calls the diagonal method, which, as he describes in his recent Bitcoin and Philosophy series, it's exactly what the critical method coincides with. As a philosophical method, it's Kant's diagram of how the synthetic a priori is produced, or more properly, auto-produced, between the double pincer grip of rationalism and empiricism. The matrix of synthetic and analytic, a posteriori and a priori, yields the synthetic a priori, which in the hands of Deleuze and Guattari is the line of flight, the production of the new. For Land, this structure is another diagram of modernity and illuminates, most specifically, the operation of capital itself. Innovation as the production, modernity as the obliteration of old prejudices and the grinding away of the flawed and unworkable. These are the historico-material correspondences to philosophical critique, the method itself as that which annihilates metaphysics. He finds in Bitcoin the intensification of this identification. Bitcoin is, in the very strictest sense, a critical enterprise, targeting trusted third parties as superfluous metaphysical structures. With both the blockchain system and the patchwork DAO system it is anticipated to empower, a common diagrammatic matrix can be drawn. There are two sets of oppositions. On the one hand, high connectivity, and on the other, low connectivity. And then you also have high integration and low integration. The measure of connectivity denotes the allowance of flows between units, such as capital, goods, money, etc., while the measure of integration denotes social conformity, governance, shared identity, so on and so forth. Land suggests that the diagonal method yields the formula of high connectivity, low integration. rising interconnection of flows, and a falling socio-political cohesiveness. This corresponds not only to the real trend of disintermediation, but to the cypherpunk vision of the empowered agent, the real historical realization of Homo economicus. A common counterpoint to theories of fragmentation and atomization such as these is that while, yes, the latter is palpable on the individualized and especially the affective level, overall the tendency is towards centralization and conglomeration and not the reverse. One could point, for examples, to the continuity of monopoly capitalism across time, or to the emergence of a platform capitalism as a successor stage to monopoly capitalism. Capital itself might be autonomous from the nation state, but money is held by a progressively smaller number of individuals. And while the leading lights of empire, the United States and the European Union, are both threatened internally, such as the runaway polarization in the case of each, and the active threat of secession and Euroscepticism in the latter, also threatened externally, such as the rise of Russia and China, transnational institutions like NATO and mechanisms such as the multinational free trade agreements do seem capable, at least at this stage, of weathering these various storms. A full treatment of this question is beyond the scope of the present talk, but it is vitally important into discussing the role of the blockchain in any future governance. Thus, a few additional comments are in order. To start, a word of caution. We should not expect the trend towards centralization and concentration to be universal, or to serve as the primary drift of historical development. The existence of fragmentation is something that must be reckoned with, not only because of the clear relationship between it and political polarization, as illustrated brilliantly by Peter Turchin, but on account of mounting knowledge problems and coordination issues that are produced by the rising complexity that we see today. Yet, by the same token, this fragmentation must not also be taken as a universal inevitability, or even the key characteristic of the long arc of development. The benefits of fragmentation collide messily with the advantages of scale, the necessity of bureaucracy, and the importance of administration. For every form of connectivity, there must be common protocols and infrastructures for the connected to carry out their exchanges and circulations. And how does the need for these protocols and infrastructures manifest, if not by forms of integration? It could be very well that integration and connectivity are not elements to be arranged in an oppositional grid. Higher degrees of integration might themselves be the requirement for connectivity, which is a relationship that has no truck with the number of potentially connected sovereign units. Furthermore, it could be that forms of integration are the requirements for the relative autonomy and self-sufficiency of a given unit. From this point of view, the flattened, two-dimensional picture of patchwork begins to fray at its very seams. Something at once more concrete and abstract, deeper in line with the emergent topologies of our impending future world, is required. Concerns of a similar sort have been raised in a recent essay by Ash Milton on the topic of experimental government. While his topic focuses on charter cities, it is easily applicable to the discussion of patchwork and other DAO systems. This is because, after all these things are mingled at the genetic level. The charter city, as its original proponent Paul Romer describes, is a startup city in which one can propose something entirely new and let people choose whether or not they want to live under its rules as embodied in the charter, the document that specifies its founding principles. People who want to try to reform can go there, and people who don't have to. With a startup, you can have reform without coercion. This, in the language of most specifically Nick Land, would correspond with the idea of having exit, the right to leave, over voice, that is democratic representation, or something along those lines. One of Romer's chief examples is the post-Maoist transformation of Shenzhen to a special economic zone. But as Milton points out, proponents of political decentralization have little to gain from relying on this and other related examples. Here's a rather lengthy quote from Milton's very interesting essay on this topic. This interest is counterintuitive when considering the inspiration for charter cities. The strategic role of Hong Kong, Macau, and the SEZs, special economic zones, for testing reforms are ultimately directed by the Chinese Communist Party. The United Arab Emirates is a federation of Islamic monarchies. In this light, the tie between the charter city and decentralized market liberalism is not at all obvious. A major feature in the success of each of these projects is the backing by a single established host government, able to guarantee institutions and reap the strategic benefits of the project. This should be significant for anyone thinking about global development. What if the control of these projects by strong host governments is an essential feature of their success, not just a historical accident that can be abstracted into the future? If so, this would present a contradiction between the libertarian ideals of many charter city advocates and the state power actually driving this wave of city and economic zone construction. Charter cities would not weaken and decentralize the nation-state governments, but in fact secure and strengthen them. Charter cities and similar projects provide platforms for policy and economic innovation with low political risks, among other benefits. This being so, it seems likely that these projects will only be undertaken in cases where the controlling state interests serve to strengthen their positions. Considering the potential trajectory of blockchain technologies in light of this brings us closer to the territory of the delayed development hypothesis, in which blockchain, along with the decentralizing possibilities inherent in it, are actualized in pursuit of an optimal mode of regulation. Further evidence for this can be gleaned from the fact that while there are plenty of divergent uses being developed for blockchain technologies, from the aforementioned DAOs to the more left-wing experiments such as Ethereum's proposed liquid democracy, many of the practical applications are being explored by currently existing statist and corporate governing bodies. Estonia, for example, is making blockchain a central figure in its transformation into a digital republic, in which the lion's share of normal services that the government is involved in, legislation, voting, education, justice, healthcare, banking, taxes, policing, and so on, have been digitally linked across one platform, wiring up the nation. The mechanism here is the KSI blockchain, which, as the government's rundown of the project tells us, protects Estonian e-services such as the e-prescription database, the e-law and e-court systems, e-police data, e-banking, e-business register, and the e-land registry. Estonia, however, is not the only client using this technology. The KSI white paper brags that it is also being used by the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, the European Union Intelligence Technology Agency, the U.S. Department of Defense, also by Lockheed Martin, Ericsson, and others. The list of governmental projects assessing blockchain technology or actively implementing it is constantly expanding. There's the recent study done by the U.S. Treasury Department's Bureau of Fiscal Services, which determined that blockchain technology could be a key asset in the event that what is needed is a structured central repository of information where multiple parties accessing the database in the scenario have less than total trust. They also continue that the capacity for the automation of functions so as to eliminate unnecessary figures in a given process is a desirable goal. This would follow along with the ability to introduce self-executing mechanisms to replace manual execution, that is, basically automating rote governmental functioning. These insights arose from the introduction of two projects that utilize the technology to assist both private and public sector actors. Overseen by the Bureau's Office of Financial Innovation and Transformation, the goal has been to successfully track both financial and physical assets in real time in order to streamline and better control these processes. This is similar, in turn, to the growing interest in blockchain by the field of supply chain management. According to Reed Williams of the design firm IDEO, blockchain stands to become a new supply chain operating system due to its ability to render visible the entirety of the chain, a problem that, despite incredible advancements in logistical technology, has continued to persist. As a shared, secured record of exchange, blockchain can track what went into a project and who handled it along the way, breaking supply chains out of data silos and revealing the provenance of a product to everyone involved from originator to end user. There are countless other examples that could be forth in addition to the above. The transformation of Dubai into a blockchain city as part of the UAE government's Emirates Blockchain Strategy 2021, the studies of blockchain called for by the Chinese Communist Party. Slovenia's drive to become the global blockchain capital would be another case, among many others. In each of these instances, we might catch a glimpse of the libertarian impulse. The general intent of the governmental blockchain experiments is to empower various actors in the networks and to promote stabilized growth while also eliminating unnecessary actors and structures. At the same time, however, it is clear that they are also being used to support the state as an administrative machine, and what is more is that it is removing from the state the human element. In the unity with other emergent techniques, namely artificial intelligence and other modes of algorithmic governmentality, we could be very well seeing the emergence of a new state form, one that is finally in alignment with the demands of the current K-wave coming into view. All right. I'm going to switch gears here a little and talk about art. I have to confess I was a little flummoxed when I was first asked to write a piece on blockchain and art. Even after reading the otherwise great artists rethinking the blockchain, exploring the world of art based on blockchain or oriented to critical dialogue about it, the nature of how these two things joined eluded me. But as I've learned through my current project, which is a book dealing with the history of tangled webs of transnational, politically inclined subcultures that have persisted over the last 5 decades, I can realize that artistic creation, especially the kind that takes on what we might call an avant political character, is intimately connected with the particularities of development relative to themselves. While this might sound like a realization bordering on the banal in its obviousness, what I like to do is stress the way that this sort of creative engagement is capable of operating within the sort of techno-economic possibility space that may otherwise be imperceptible, where new articulations and potential futures for these technical systems, infrastructures, and relations can be devised, advanced, and even executed. It's worth saying a few words about the Marxian vision of post-capitalism, which I think this is fundamentally bound to. It's given its best formulations in the draft of Capital, and most specifically in the infamous fragment on the machines. If any of you are familiar with the quasi-accelerationist reading of Marx offered by notorious blogger Jehu, I'm actually not sure how to pronounce his name, you'll know his rather memeable slogan, "Communism is free time and nothing else." This derives in no small part from this fragment. Here, Marx emphasizes a twofold transformation that characterizes the long-term development of the capitalist mode of production, just something that supersedes each of the individual K-waves that we have discussed earlier. For Marx, both of these twofold elements are actually faces of one and the same process. On one hand, you have mechanization or automation, which annihilates the agental capacity of the individual laborer in the sense that labor becomes increasingly abstract, routine, rushing to the point in which the worker is but a conscious linkage in a cyclopean, self-moving industrial automaton. On the other hand, you have the escalation of techno-scientific development, which comes to underpin this higher level of social instantiation in the form of the general intellect. There's a kind of recursive relationship here, in which the techno-scientific development accelerates the process through which industry plummets towards the horizon of total mechanization. Indeed, the agency of the laborer with respect to the distinct processes of production is eliminated, in continuation with the historical trend that began with the transition from craft production to mass production as the primary base for social organization. A new sort of agental expression arises, one that is oriented towards the new emergent kinds of technoscience. Through each, domination by labor is displaced, and a temporal space outside of labor becomes a ghost that haunts the capitalist world. If the history of all previous economies are histories of how time and labor give rise to social organization, then what comes into a bleak view in capitalism is unlike anything remotely than what has happened before. Prehistory, to paraphrase Marx, comes to a close. In the fragment, we read, "Capital itself is moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time on the other side as the sole measure and source of wealth. Hence, it diminishes labor time in the necessary form, so as to increase it in the superfluous form. Hence, posits the superfluous and growing measure as a condition, question of life or death, for the necessary. On the one side, then, it calls to life all the powers and sciences of nature, as of social combination and of social intercourse, in order to make the creation of wealth independent, relatively, of labor time employed on it. On the other side, it wants to use labor time as the measuring rod for the giant social forces thereby created, and to confine them within the limits required to maintain the already created value as value. Forces of production and social relations, two different sides of the development of the social individual, appear to capital as mere means, and are merely means for it to produce on its own limited foundation. In fact, however, they are the material conditions to blow this foundation sky high. Following this, Marx quotes from an anonymously drafted pamphlet from 1821. It's titled "The Source and the Remedy of National Difficulties Deduced from the Principles of Political Economy." In brief, the argument of this pamphlet is that the development of productive technologies portends a situation in which free time becomes the measure of social wealth as opposed to material accumulation. Getting to this point entails nothing short of undermining the very logic of capitalism, so the mysterious author suggests that the bourgeoisie will do everything in their power to halt the arrival of this situation, even if that means sabotaging the very mode of production that grants them wealth. Anyways, here's the line that Marx offers to flesh out his argument. Wealth is not command over surplus labor time, real wealth, but rather disposable time outside that needed in direct production for every individual and for the whole society. Marcuse's Eros and Civilization tracks this line of inquiry into the realm of Freudian psychoanalysis, and is in this intersection that the question of the aesthetic dimension returns. Without running down the whole structure of this argument, already on the 14th page of my talk draft, let me offer just the briefest of summaries. Civilization, Freud argues, exists insofar as the reality principle is to inflect itself, with the repression of the primal energetics of the id being precisely the civilizing force that makes the dominant mode of social organization possible. Under capitalism, this proceeds through the enforced competitiveness of the members composing the social body, through the progressive rationalization of this body's organization on the macro-social scale, and by way of increasingly mechanized character of the productive forces that constitute both the alpha and omega of this civilization. The result here is alienation. The individual is choked off from itself, the split between the performance nature of the reality principle and the wild drift of the pleasure principle reverberating through the divisions of the capitalist world and the so-called solutions it gives to the social problem. Marcuse counterposes this condition through a negation of unfreedom that he calls the Great Refusal, a term for a sort of absolute revolution necessary to abolish the capitalist mode of production and to actualize a different world in the wake of this revolution. He quotes Whitehead here, invoking the protest against unnecessary repression, the struggle for the ultimate form of freedom to live without anxiety. Such a life is one in which the constraints that subjugate lived experience and desire to some external transcendent factor are exploded. Liberation is precisely the releasing of this libidinal charge from its repression, and is by way of this unshackling of the pleasure principle that the despotism of the reality principle comes to be abolished. Marcuse's discussion seems posed to lend itself to the sort of praxis lauded by the neo-anarchists, with their appeals to the immediacy of desire and the swift flight from this world, and indeed the language of the Great Refusal, capable of subverting the most hallowed mores and technological and grim shit. Marcuse's discussion seems posed to lend itself to the sort of praxis lauded by the neo-anarchists, with their appeals to immediacy of desire and the swift flight from this world, and indeed the language of a great refusal capable of subverting the most hollowed mores and mechanical and grim of capitalist machinations is something that, at first blush, lends itself to this read. Marcuse's argument, however, is anything but, and appeals instead to the proper Marxian treatment of historical development. The escalation of alienation is tracked to the widening industrial logic described by Marx, especially that in the fragment of the machines. Marcuse describes, no matter how justly and rationally the material production may be organized, it can never be a realm of freedom and gratification, but it can release time and energy for the free play of human faculties outside the realm of alienated labor. The more complete the alienation of labor, the greater the potential for freedom. Total automation would be the optimum. Similarly, in one of his many correspondences, he writes that arrested, restricted automation saves the capitalist system, while consummated automation would explode it. The humanization of labor, its connection with life, etc., is only possible through complete automation, because the humanization is correctly relegated by Marx to the realm of labor of freedom beyond the realm of necessity, i.e., beyond the entire realm of socially necessary labor and material production. Total dehumanization of the latter is the prerequisite. Marcuse, being a classic Frankfurt School philosopher, is sensitive to the ways in which the domination of the capitalist mode of production makes reason appear as repression. It's a complicated dialectical situation. The realization of reason, or perhaps the production of new reason, as he will describe in One-Dimensional Man, corresponds to this liberation, but reason appears as aiding the suppression of this liberation all the same. That which is beyond capital must, therefore, present itself as outside of reason, which for Marcuse is the realm of fantasy, that is, imagination, and the vantage point from which to explore this domain is through the aesthetic register. Marcuse privileges, in particular, the great work of the Surrealists, suggesting that they found the spirit of the Great Refusal by recognizing that the revolutionary implication of Freud's discoveries, imagination is about to reclaim its rights. But they, the Surrealists, asked, cannot the dream also be applied to the solution of the fundamental problems of life? They went beyond psychoanalysis in demanding that the dream be made into reality without compromising its content. At this point in Eros and Civilization, Marcuse passes into the real movement of the Kantian account of the imagination. The imagination, for Kant, is that which mediates between sensibility, which is the faculty that produces sensory representations, and understanding, which draws representations together to produce a means of processing an experience of the world and operating within it. But as Marcuse highlights, the imagination is also bound up with the aesthetic dimension. It's a space that occupies the central position between sensuousness, which is passive or receptive sensory experience, and morality, the two poles of human existence. Marcuse writes, as imagination, the aesthetic perception is both sensuousness and at the same time more than sensuousness, a third basic facility. It gives pleasure and is therefore essentially subjective, but insofar as this pleasure is constituted by the pure form of the object itself, it accompanies the aesthetic perception universally and necessarily for any perceiving subject. Although sensuousness and therefore receptive, the aesthetic imagination is creative. In a free synthesis of its own, it constitutes beauty. In the aesthetic dimension, sensuousness generates universally valid principles for an objective order. Now, these universally valid principles, says Marcuse, are purposiveness without purpose and lawfulness without law. These, he continues, circumscribe, beyond the Kantian context, the essence of a truly non-repressive order. The first defines the structure of beauty, the second that of freedom. Their common character is gratification in the free play of the released potentialities of man and nature. Marcuse here goes to move from Kant for whom this system denotes internal cognitive functions, to Schiller, who takes this structure and finds in it the blueprint for a truly free organization of society. His letters on the aesthetic education of man, written in 1795, was drafted largely under the influence of the Critique of Judgment, aimed at remaking civilization by virtue of liberating the forces of the aesthetic function. It is envisioned as containing the possibility of a new reality principle. In other words, moving beyond the performance principle to the realignment of the libido with expenditure and reason with flourishing, instinctively elevates civilization into the aesthetic dimension. The role of the technical systems is clear. How could one hope to realize, without abandoning oneself to the idle masturbations of idealism, a purposiveness without purpose and a lawfulness without law, without finding that optimal state of total automation? The problem of articulating the nature of this transformation, or how to begin to approach this possibility of considering this transformation, still remains elusive, serving as a largely blind spot in the pages of Eros and Civilization. This blind spot ultimately grows into the pessimistic vision laid forth in One-Dimensional Man. Similarly, when Marcuse returns to the question of the aesthetic dimension in the 1970s, his tone has changed more than a little, emphasizing the importance of not mistaking art as revolutionary in itself and insisting on the preservation of classical artistic values in the face of late capitalist nihilism. By the same token, however, he would also insist that his views are in continuity, and that his work of the 1970s was an extension, not a repudiation, of his earlier explorations in this strange realm. For our purposes here, what light can this overt politicalization shed on the relationship between art and the possibility space opened up by the techno-economic development processes that we've been sketching? An answer, which at this stage must be rather lowly and underdeveloped, is to approach the aesthetic dimension through a constructive lens, by which I mean the simultaneous subordination of the aesthetic dimension to the construction of a new society and the releasing of the conditions for experimentation from the stipulations of the reality principle. This isn't an art that simply embodies the world to come or captures the sense of freedom that can be made possible by the release of time from production's grasp, but an art that takes an active role in building that world. What I have in mind most specifically are the various schools of thought that flourished in revolutionary Russia, mostly in the pre-Stalinist period, which took a hold of the new technological systems and infrastructures that were being installed by the advent of the Fordist phase of capitalism, then used them to illustrate even better, newer forms of life, new environments that would produce radically new forms of lived experience. This was consistent with the stated intentions of the new government. Lenin, in his 1918 declarations on the immediate tasks of the Soviet government, stated that the Soviet Union must at all costs adopt all that is valuable in the achievements of science and technology in the field of scientific management. The possibility of socialism depends exactly upon our success in combining the Soviet power and the Soviet organization of administration with the up-to-date achievements of capitalism. We must organize in Russia the study and teachings of the Taylor system and systematically try to adopt it to our own ends. Different tendencies emerged around this question, each with their own interpretation of how the Fordist paradigm could be leveraged. For people like Alexei Gastev, the proletarian poet who became head of Moscow's Central Labor Institute, the rhythms of industrialized production were to reformat all aspects of life, both social and private, under their own dictates. The New World, the motor car and the aeroplane factories of America, and finally, the arms industry of the whole world, whether we live in the age of super-imperialism or of world socialism, the structure of the new industry will be in essence one and the same. For others, like Alexander Bogdanov, who took issue with the technocratic bent of Gastev's work, who did anticipate the flattening of the proletariat into a faceless, nameless, serial-numbered mass, whose entire being was oriented to the movement of industrial machinery, Bogdanov, on the other hand, anticipated a scenario in which the worker would be elevated, no longer just a mere worker of the capitalist mode of production, but a worker artist, a worker engineer, and a worker scientist. Similar to the portrait drawn in Marx's Fragments of the Machine, he described how work in industry would tend to become more and more of a single type, but at the same time, industrialism was producing ever more workers of the highest type, the creative machinist who shares in the planning, regulating, and fulfilling functions of the factory. So in some respects, both Gastev and Bogdanov's, what they both anticipated was technocratic, but for the former, the proletariat was subjected to technocratic ends, whereas in the latter, the proletariat took an active role in shaping a technocratic destiny. Of particular interest here was how these different strands were received within Gosplan, the agency that was tasked with developing and administrating social planning. The influences tended to be mediated through the works of the constructivists, who came to speak of a social condenser, which was to be a new perspective to govern Soviet architecture and urban design. Promethean in scope, the social condenser would marshal the cutting edge of productive technology, managerial techniques, and rational planning to execute a grand vision that would transform the conditions of communal life by annihilating individualized, atomistic experience of things. Indeed, even the term condenser was a reference to the technology that was sweeping across and irreversibly mutating the landscape. To quote Anatoly Kope, like electrical condensers that transform the nature of current, the architects' proposed social condensers were to turn the self-centered individual of capitalist society into a whole man, the informed militant of a socialist society in which the interests of each emerged with the interests of all. Referencing the motion of the body in laboring mode, Gastev had declared that the perfect mastery of a given moment implies the maximum degree of automaticity. If this maximum increases, nervous energy would be freed for a new initiating stimuli, and the power of the individual will grow indefinitely. The social condenser worked in a similar manner, maximizing the rational management of the system, in this case the social tapestry and its architectural contours, to produce a baseline for the realization of an unrealized, untapped energy. This reached its fantastical peak in the grand, near-delirious vision proffered by L.M. Sapsevich, an economist and planner at Gosplan, who was more than just a little influenced by the spectacular socialist projects described by Bogdanov in his science fiction novels. In his mind, the industrial systems realized in the Fordist epoch constituted the key to the actualizations of a utopia. One can feel the same spirit that fueled Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, guiding Sapsevich, as Richard Stites writes. Building on the whole tradition of socialist dreams of household collectivism, Sapsevich imagined the coordination of all food processing. Sorry, that is my cat walking in front of the... Imagined the coordination of all food processing operations in order to transform raw food products into complete meals, deliverable to the population in urban cafeterias, communal dining rooms, and the workplace in ready-to-eat form by means of thermos containers. No food shopping, no cooking, no home needs, no kitchens. Similar industrialization of laundering, tailoring, repair, and even house cleaning with electrical appliances would allow each person a sleeping living room free of all maintenance cares. Russia would, in fact, become a vast free-of-charge hotel chain. He continues to discuss how essentially the entire city would become a massive collectivized unit, fully automated for the realization of a new form of life. Now, there is a real gap between the real present and any sort of possible near future. And it's in this gap that a revival of the concept of the artist-engineer, the worker-artist, the artist-scientist must insert itself. This entails a rejection of design as a laboratory for the commodity and an abandonment of so-called political art's position as a medium for piecemeal critique and commentary, which is a disastrous reflection of the liberal ideal if there ever was one. calls for a rigorous engagement with the study of technical systems, economic flux, administrative organization, the various patterns that link into one another across the various scales of our turbulent world system. It also means to not reject outright certain technical objects or systems for their perceived ideological basis, for these things can never be reduced to what their most stalwart proponents have in store for them. They have a productive logic of their own, and the law of unintended consequences is only the tip of the iceberg. Now, to bring this down a little more to earth and immediately to our purposes here, is the blockchain that stands as the excellent example of just this sort of technical object. Maligned by the left as a libertarian tool, praised by the anarcho-capitalists as a mean of progressing towards the minimal state, or perhaps the even more atomized forms of politico-economic behavior, the blockchain appears as something that has no place of any sort in this future that's being discussed. Yet, as we've seen, the blockchain is not just the subject of inquiry by libertarians and anarcho-capitalists. It is also presented an array of options to the state as well, from the automation of daily functions to the organization of welfare systems to advanced record keeping. Likewise, the blockchain has also attracted the eye of those looking to optimize sensor systems, that largely imperceptible tool of 21st century governance. One example of this is that Nokia's recent proposal for a blockchain-powered Internet of Things that will monetize the analysis of data pulled from urban sensor networks, while another might be the usage of smart sensors and blockchain to effectively manage decentralized green energy power grids in an urban environment. The difficulty is to avoid either pitfall, either the libertarian or anarcho-capitalist, or even further, neo-reactionary positions, or those of the liberal left, social democratic light solutions to the developmental question, all of which sequester themselves under the rubric of the performance principle. The real question, what could something like Nokia's proposed system do if freed from the impulse to monetize data? How could blockchain assist in managing decentralized power systems in a situation in which the difference between town and country has been torn asunder? Can the automation of state administration, industrial process, and logistical systems be deployed to bring us into an alignment with an unavoidable alien future? The questions are ultimately of a political nature and can in no way be reduced to the figure of the blockchain, for they are embedded in the matrices of century-long development, one that weighs on the ability for us to act. There is also an aesthetic component here, as we have seen. It is the component that tries to articulate in advance a political vision that it can never capture, but in doing so, produces something essential for the struggle to realize that vision. The reclamation of modernity, the opening up of an alternative modernity that executes the vital task of breaking with the past and the goal of realizing a new reality principle, a new reason. Thank you.